Travis, you're on next.
I am. Awesome. Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and anybody else. Originally, I was scheduled to do a segmented blank demo, and of course, life interferes and had to cancel. I think Gordon ended up doing a similar presentation. James kept me on the schedule, and then he said I would be doing it for November, and said I would be doing a demo on exotic materials. It was kind of caught me by surprise. I didn't know exactly what he meant. When I think of exotic materials, I think of mother of pearl, some other items like that. But when you do that, turn mother of pearl, you're not actually turning it, because it's generally cast, so you're actually turning, the alumilite or the polyester or whatever. So I started thinking, what's exotic to me? I do antler, I've done metal, plastic, all kinds of plastics from, polyurethane, polyester, acrylic, HDE, whatever. So I started thinking the most exotic thing I could think of is leather. You can turn leather. So I'm going to be demonstrating some of the techniques I've used to do that. I'm not going to do a longitudinal leather wrapped blank. I mean, I've seen people do that, and I've seen them do multiple ways of how you do the seam, either stitch it or glue it or whatever, then cast it. Then you're not really turning leather again. You're back to turning plastic. What I'm going to do is a stacked leather demonstration. Over here to the other camera. Originally, I started sharpening my tools, and even at 220, there's lots of grind marks on the blade itself, and that just drives me nuts. So I've seen carvers, they have wheels or leather pads that they put a buffing compound or a sharpening compound like ZAM and use that to polish and sharpen their blades. So I've seen wheels. So I made this little wheel in my shop. It's nothing but 2 pieces of MDF laminated together. I glued a block on it. I have the die to drill the hole and thread it for my lathe. Then I went over to Tandy Leather in San Antonio. It was over off Walsham, and you can buy a box of scrap, and they come in all shapes and sizes, just like this. Anyway, and I bought a box of scrap that had a piece in it, and I just glued it to this. There's a notch in here, so it wedges the ends in. This green is a ZAM. So on my older tools, after sharpening them, I'll bring them over here, put this on my lathe, and polish the back bevel to a mirror shine. That being said, obviously, I bought a box that was like 18 by 18 by 6 inches, just full of cutoffs. And over there at Tandy, they actually make different bags and belts and whatever. And you can get the cutoffs. You can go in and buy a full sheet of cowhide or horsehide, goat hide, whatever. But you can get it in different thicknesses, stiffness, coarseness. One side's usually smooth, back side is usually rough. And if you buy them in scraps, you can usually get a pretty good haul for relatively affordable price, rather than if you buy an uncut hide, that's way more than you need. But anyway, so you need to cut it. You can just cut this with regular, I use either an X-Acto knife. Here's one right here. I sharpen it. Now, most blanks that you buy that are pre-made are cut at 3/4 of an inch, I believe. Yes, this is 3/4 of an inch. I tend to overdo it, and I just take a steel ruler. This is 1 inch wide. I'll lay it on here. That's not a straight line, but that's okay. We don't care because we're going to be cutting this down. I will score it a couple of times. Keep it pressed against the metal, otherwise it drifts off and you won't get it. Then you can just take this and right there cut. You'll have to, depending on how sharp your knife is, you may have to do 3, 4, 5, even 5 passes. My blade here is sharper when I push it, but that's a little more dangerous, so I always do a pull stroke. Yeah, see, and I got out of the seam right there. Yeah, go back. And yes, I sharpened this today, so it does take a little work to cut through it. Okay. Cut as many strips as you want. For this demonstration, I'm only going to do this one piece because I'm not going to keep cutting on it. This is stiff. You can soften it by, I have a little water here, and it can soften it up and be a lot more flexible. Then same thing, I just cut there, got a rough 1 inch by 1 inch square. Okay, and go all the way down the line till you get a stack. Now, knowing in advance that I'm going to use Gorilla Glue, not the regular white glue, I'm doing the polyurethane Gorilla Glue. That's a water activated one. I'm going to soak these in water for a bit. That will help soften it so that when I clamp it together, it'll compress a little more. It'll also activate the glue. Glue will soak in better, adhere. Now, polyurethane glue, if you've never worked with it, I like it for this application because it expands when it cures. It turns into a foam. So I've pre-cut a bunch already. I did them in 1 inch squares, and Experiment also did the 3/4 inch squares. 1 inch are a little easier to handle. So anyway, let's say I know in advance I'm going to make a Wall Street 2 pin. So I want to make a blank that will accommodate this tube. This is the standard Wall Street 2 27/64 diameter tube. I forget the actual length. So I will, just to make sure I have enough pieces of leather, I'll just stack them up to get an approximate height, length, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so I need a few more. And I want to be over the length, not under. Anyway, there you go. So there, I probably got one too many. I also know in advance when I squeeze this down, it's going to compress a little bit, so I'll go ahead and add at least one more. And if you'll see, I don't know if the camera can pick that up, this is a little long for that. So when I squeeze it more, it's too short, so I need to add another. I've squeezed it real tight, and there it's longer than my tube. Okay, so Gorilla Glue is messy. It'll stain your skin, so you don't want to get it on your skin. I don't want to glue to my little backer board here, so I got a little piece of wax paper. I'm going to put on some gloves for this. You can use other glues. You can use CA, you can use epoxy. There's some others. Never tried hide glue on it because I really don't know its durability. But I use, like I said, polyurethane for this example because I know it expands, and if I have any voids, because this material, can flex and everything, so that's why I use polyurethane. Here's a Gorilla Glue. I don't use the nozzle. I want a little more control over the application of glue. These here I've pre-soaked, so I know they've got moisture in them. So I'm going to start with those. When you start gluing them together, my experience has been you want to keep them all oriented the same way. You have a rough side, which is the back, and then you have the smooth surface. So you want to orient them so that you've got back to smooth, or rough side, smooth side, all the way through. If you try to glue two smooth sides together, they tend to want to slip and slide. So that's why I always do rough side to smooth side. So I'm going to lay these out just so that I know my orientation. Okay, there we go. So I actually have a little jig I built. You don't have to use it. I should have made another piece of wax paper. Anyway, I'm going to put that in here just because I don't want my blank I'm fabricating to stick to my little jig. And I use this simply to keep, as I'm gluing, I don't want the pieces slip sliding and skewing in every direction. So for glue purposes, I just take a popsicle stick and just start. I'm going to start on the rough side just because it's easier. It doesn't matter how much you put on. I try to keep it a thin, don't overdo it, because that's just going to be more that's going to want to slide out when you start compressing the blank. I'm going to set that there first till I get another one. And just it's just got the consistency of honey. So it's gonna, now once it starts curing, this is gonna foam up, which means it expands. So you don't want to dally when you're doing this, but on the other hand, you've got a pretty long open time, so you don't have to get in a rush. Now, for tonight on this example, I'm just doing leather as the material for the blank. The one I made one this morning It was originally leather with brass shims and bloodwood and antler. And when I was drilling it to prepare it, had a slight mishap and the antler cracked. So I had to recover. So the blank we're using tonight does not have antler in it. It will have bloodwood, brass, and leather. So it's sort of a combination of different materials that people don't often turn. I do see people that use Coke cans. That's a thinner material. The brass I use, you can get brass at Hobby Town. They use it over in the modeling area. You can get aluminum, different thicknesses, sheet sizes. Copper, I have not seen in Hobby Town, but I go over to Lowe's, Home Depot, or any sort of roofing supply. The flashing that they sell is copper, or you can get copper flashing. And that's convenient because a lot of pins nowadays have a copper finish, so you can make one that has the same finish of the parts on your pin. Also, you know, we've all heard the credit card. People use credit cards. They use a hotel door keys nowadays. That's a thinner plastic than a typical credit card. You can also buy what's called pick guard. Pick guard is the plastic material you see on the box plate, surface box of a guitar. And just to confirm this, I've glued that all up. You can see it's a little long, but when I compress it, it's going to shrink down a bit. I do want it to be a little long so that I can shave it off at the end. Now, I had built at one time a little jig made out of, you know, the, what is it, high density plastic, so that I could do this without having the wax paper and not having to worry about this scooting around. But today I couldn't find it. You know, I've moved to a new shop and I'm, you know, still all out of wax to wear things in. So I just threw this together real quick. I've got multiple surfaces I can push down on, give me pressure. You want to try to keep this centered along the central axis of the blank, because if it slides over, it's going to put pressure and it's going to flare out. So there we go. And as you start tightening down, it's going to want to shimmy around. So tighten a little bit, check, make sure everything's good, push it in, push it all the way back. And you can already see it's curing because here's the white foam expanding out. And you see why also I need gloves, because I have to manipulate this pretty good. Any questions so far? Okay. Now you can squeeze this down as much as you want, because this polyurethane is a very clingy. You're not going to squeeze it all out like you could tight bond or something. You can put as much force on this as you want and you will not squeeze out all the glue. But there you go. It's all glued up. Just let it set and cure. I tend to wait overnight. And you can see there, it's still long enough to match my tube. Okay, so I'm just going to set that aside and move on to actually turning the other blank. All right. Everybody see me fine, hear me fine? We'll continue. All right, this is a blank. Once again, it's a Wall Street 2 pin blank. It's you can see the different laminations of leather. Here's brass, here's bloodwood, and we're going to turn this down. It'll turn, leather will turn just like wood, a softer wood, of course, but it'll turn, it'll sand. The finishing, it'll tend to absorb more because I have wood in here, not just leather. You know, I'm going to treat it with some other, put a different finish on it. You have to be aware that because this is not all one contiguous material, when I transition into this metal here, you got to be real careful not to take off big shavings, because this metal. Question. Do I have to sand the pieces before gluing? No, I don't do that because I'm putting rough side to smooth side. I could. I've never had any problem sanding them up. Other material like this brass, for example, I do sand it to rough it up. Anyway, back to what I was saying about this brass. When it turns and it wants to catch this corner, you have to be careful. If you take too big a bite, it's going to want to rip it out and you'll blow your blank up. So I have to be real careful there. Same thing with the wood. That's a small piece of wood. It tends to, if you catch it, it could tear out. Okay? I'm using a mandrel on this, so there is a mandrel running through this. I'm running it at approximately 2,800 RPMs. 2800. A little higher actually, 2850. That's normally the speed I roughly the range of speed I tend to turn on no matter what. I'm using a carbide tip tool. This is a round one, homemade. It works. So let's start out. See there, I can just shaves off just like wood. It's a real easy, no problem. When I get over here to the middle, I want to be real, like I said, cautious. Especially until I get it all round and consistent shape, size, I want to be real cautious. Now I'll show you again what I'm talking about on this. Close in on this, you can see this metal, it's not fully supported, so that also makes it more easy to tear out. But once I get this blank's entire diameter down where it's all consistent and there's no voids or high or low spots, things should turn better. I'm going to start in the middle. That's going to be the high point in my blank, and I'm going to work down. I can work down here like that and come over here to this edge. Anyway, I'm just going to work. Now you can see these metal shavings come off. You're going to be real cautious about that. You know, some people, me for example, I may wear sandals out in the shop. You know, that gets down, works its way in, and you could have a problem there. You see I caught it. I pulled back. I don't have this tied down so tight that it tore it out. I mean, it free spun for a second there when I pulled it out, so that's good. Now you can't see it, but a little hint for some of you people, when you're looking at your blank and you want to know if it's level or anything, if I tend to look at the top edge and you can see sort of a gray area. It's not gray, but where it's not solid. So that tells me my surface area is still not round. It means it's a little square, and that those gaps is when the highs and lows are coming around. So that's why I can tell from looking at it that I'm not round yet. Now I use brass on this. I mentioned you can get it at different hobby stores. This particular brass, a friend of mine who has a business, his next door neighbor business was a trophy shop, award shop, plaques, and they went out of business and they took all their samples and just tossed them out. And he grabbed them all for me, thinking, oh, that walnut would be great to turn and do things with. I was more interested in the metal plaques on it. I took them all off and cut them down into strips that I then use for inserting in pins like this. If you don't want to do brass, a good easy start, just take a Coke can or soda can if you don't drink Coke and cut it open. That's a real thin piece of aluminum. Be real easy to turn. Minimal problems of it can tear out, but because it's so thin, it'll probably just tear off rather than blowing up your blank. Do try to take something and sand off the inside because it'll have a coating on it to keep the acid from the soda from eating away at the metal. And then, of course, on the outside, you'll have the paint from whatever advertising or brand labeling is on it. You'll want to take that off. You can just take a piece of sandpaper or sander, however you see fit, and just sand it off. Cut it into strips, and away you go. See, this is taking a little longer simply because of this metal. I don't want to tear it out. You can see this white foam here. That's from the polyurethane glue. You can see the different layers and the different texture of the leather itself from the surface to the inside. You can just see that it gives it this striated look. I'm just going to concentrate on this brass plate, get it down. Then I can really start shaping the blank and the leather. I didn't get into the drilling. Any bit will work. The tapered ones tend to cause more issues because if you think of the shape of the tip, it's going to drill in the center of the leather, then out toward the edge of your hole. It's going to be past those flutes, and sometimes it won't slice it off good. I like to use a Forstner bit because if you think of the shape of the Forstner bit, there, you got a center point on it, then out near the outer edge are little wings that will cut down and cut in and get rid of that problem I just talked about. Problem with that is you don't often find Forstner bits in the diameter you need for most pins. 10 millimeter you can get. That's for cigar pins, which I tend to like anyway, so it's not a big problem for me. But some of the other real oddball sizes, like 25 64ths or 27 64ths, I have never found, not to say they're not made, but I've never found we got a question. What's the question?
How do you drill the blanks since it's odd shaped? Do
Uh, I've never done it by hand. I've done it both on the drill press and on the lathe if you've got the right chuck. I mean, you say it's odd shaped. It's roughly square, maybe rhombus, and that'll fit in your pin vise. That'll fit in a pin chuck. So that'll drill fine either way.
We did a little bit of sanding on the blank to get it to fit in the vise.
Well, okay. My original blank was oversized and would not fit in my pin vise. So what I did is took it over to the sander, knocked the corners off, then it would fit in there, no problem. So it depends on how you're going to do it. If I was drilling on the lathe with a chuck, chuck, that can open up real big. It'll accommodate any particular size. Now, if you're going to do that, you tend to want to have a consistent shape. I mean, you could take all kinds of leather fragments and glue it up, but you're going to have an odd side. Like if you'll notice on my blank, I mean, it was one side is pushed up flush against my little jig over here. So at least one side will be true that I can align with a drill press or vise or something. Okay? Any other questions?
What glue do you use to glue the tube?
I either use epoxy or CA. I do CA mostly simply because it's fast and easy. If I don't have to worry about time, I'll use epoxy. I could do polyurethane as well, but because it's foams, it could apply pressure on the tube. Unless I clamp it, it could be shifting around as it's curing. So I would then have to put it back in a jig just to keep it from sliding out the end of my blank. Or if I do epoxy, you just, slide and go. Any other questions? Okay. Now you notice this little piece came off. That's because the blank was a little long, so when I trued it up with my mill, it had a little bit of an overhang there. So that's all that is. It's not a blowout or anything. It was just a little overhang. You see that in wood. And there it goes. So you'll see everything's cool. Cool. All right. I was watching the business portion of the meeting. Sadly, I couldn't hear it. I saw Gordon with his great safety presentation on protecting your eyes. There's different types of equipment, different goggles. And I too am wearing, safety glasses. What's cool about these glasses is they have bifocals built in. And, I don't know about y'all, but you reach a certain age, and there's probably quite a few of y'all in the club, Robert. And so that could use and benefit from these. I'm cleaning my tip because as I'm turning, I get stuff gunk that kind of builds up on the back edge of my bevel. You can see right there a lot of brass. I don't know what kind of resolution we have with the camera, but you can see a lot of brass shavings come flying off. Right there. Now, I tend to anytime I use epoxy or polyurethane glue, wait, it's always for blanks. I'm not in a hurry to turn. I wait, at least till the next day. usually I'll make, you know, that's going to be a night I'm in the shop building blanks and I'm not turning. And one of the side effects of it is I don't have to worry about uncured glue building up on the backs of my blade, because I've done that in the past, and oh, then you got to set and with these and clean them. But with these inserts, it's not a big a problem as it was with my other tools, my traditional tools. Question. I'll stop the lathe.
Can you use the bandsaw to cut the metal pieces?
You can. It depends on your blade, the rip tooth count. Oh, can you cut the metal with a bandsaw? A qualified yes. It depends on your blade. If you've got a low tooth count, it's not going to work. You're going to end up, it's just going to tear it all up and bounce around, and you're not going to be able to get a decent cut. If you've got a real high, they make blades for ferrous, for cutting metal. I would recommend having one of those if you want to use a bandsaw to do it. I have a little Dremel with, and you can buy a little cutoff disc. They're real cheap, and they work great. You have a lot more control over it. You have a smaller tool, and I have a handheld hand piece that I use and hold it and cut them down. And when I do this, I tend to cut down a lot so that I just have them. I have a bunch of strips of brass. Like I said, I took the original ones, and I had a friend who had a metal brake. It's a metal shear, and we just stuck in there, you know, every inch, and it just chopped off all these long strips of brass, and I have them in a box, and when I need them, I'll take one, and I get like 6 or 7 pieces out of it, and just cut them up, you know, use what I want, throw the rest back in the box. Anything else? Okay. On this, I use a small piece of bloodwood. I actually cut it for this specific purpose, for this blank. However, if you turn pins, I can guarantee every one of you has a bucket or something somewhere with little cutoffs in it. That would be a great use. Doing something like this would be a great use if you wanted to combine them, multiple materials, and make a blank rather than having one. Now this one, I got great in-laws. They actually sent me a box of exotic woods, and they were about 24 inches long. And so I'm in tall cotton, all kinds of exotics. And they had one in there. They had two. One that was the typical pin diameter of 3/4 by 3/4 and 2 foot long. They also had a peppermill size, like 3 inches square by 24 inches long. And I love bloodwood. It's great for accents, nice, hard, turns great. I mean, I can just go on and on about its virtues. And it stays red, unlike Purple Heart, which when exposed to UV sunlight, it'll start turning brown. So bloodwood, I like it. Now there's other woods that are red. There's redwood, there's yellowwood, but those I can't vouch for the durability and longevity of the color, whereas bloodwood, yeah, I've never had any fading issues with it at all. Now this turns, it's almost like a fine sawdust, this leather, when you turn it. It looks like big chunks, but as soon as you touch those streamers, they fall apart. So it's kind of interesting. Now leather, if any of y'all have worked with leather, I mean, you can dye it, you can burnish it, which they have a tool usually made out of bone that they, or hardwood that they use to burnish it, and they just rub back and forth, and it does exactly what you think it would. It sort of hardens and polishes the leather. They do that usually on the edges of work pieces. Still not round yet. A little bit of a flat. I'm trying to, I'm going to have it taper. I'm trying to get a consistent graduation from this brass ring down. It's a little high right here. So I'm trying to make that a nice flat. Now I got a little bit of a tear out right there. I did catch it. So I'm going to fill that in with CA, and then I'll sand it for a finish. I don't have, probably you just saw me there. What I did is come in with my bevel on this side, rubbing it against my bushing, and got a perfect fit. Now what I do, there have been occasions, especially when my bushings get old and start thinning, what I do, and every one of my students I showed this to, when I take it off the lathe, I then take, it's an emery board or any sort of sandpaper, and then I slightly chamfer the edge all the way around. So if I am proud, that will knock it down, and because the human touch is very sensitive, just running your fingertips across it, you'll feel that. But just slightly, just knocking that 90-degree off, most people can't see it. And that's why when I'm turning, I just take my fingernail, and if it's catching, it's too high, and it's not catching. So there. So now I'm ready to sand. I'm gonna take the tool rest out since I don't know how to move this. Now you can use whatever abrasive you're comfortable with. You can use regular sandpaper. This is Norton 150, 220, 320, 400. I take just a sheet, lay my ruler across it, slice it off, put a number of 1, 2, 3, 4, and I normally have either a close clip or one of those little black paper holders. And I'm going to use these. You can also use, I love this stuff. This is Abranet. I mean, I bought a box of assorted sheets running from, I think, 80 all the way up to 600. They come in, what was it, a 3x9 sheet. I cut them in half, then cut them in fourths. And that's been 10, 12 years ago. And these are still working. There's one or two in the higher grids, like 400, which is hard to tell. So, but luckily I have 4 sets. It is not cheap, but it's definitely proved its longevity. So, how I sand, a little different. I could slow it down, but I sand at the same speed. I take my 2 middle fingers, and that's what applies pressure. You don't want to sit there and pull your sandpaper this way because it stresses it and it'll rip and tear. If you want this to last, of course, it doesn't have to. Do this. I come up from the bottom, take these 2 fingers and apply it. You've got this edge of the sandpaper, you've got this edge of the sandpaper. I don't want to ruin my bushings. I want them to last as long as possible. I do know I'm going to sand them sometimes. So this edge should not go past the end of the blanket into my bushing. Try to minimize it. Same thing on this side. Also, I don't like to just sit there back and forth. You're going to get radial sanding rings. And I mean, you can get rid of them. You can stop your lathe and then sand longitudinally and that'll get rid of them. So what I do, just little circles like a random orbital sander. This is moving and I'm moving, a little orbital pattern that minimizes and helps cut down on your scratches. And then just a light finger touch. And I'll turn it this way so you can see how I'm getting. It's sanding no problem. I do pull a little bit just to, for the up and down motion, but I'm not bending it over and pulling it this way. Then clean my paper. Look at this. There is some little bit of marks there. Actually, there's some glue there. So I can spend a little quality time right there. I can sand back and forth slowly. Now, when I'm doing this, my finger there is pressed up against it so I can feel it. I'm pushing down with my thumb. And then with my other hand, I'm rotating the mandrel, the pin blank, so I can see what's going on. I'm doing one end of the blank right now down here on this end. Try to do some quality. If I see any scratch, I need to get it out now, because Gordon will tell you, if you don't get it out now, all you're going to do when you go to a higher grid is make a real pretty scratch. Now this has metal in it, so I could go ahead and when I'm sanding go up from 400, go 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200 and all that to do the metal. But since this is such little amount of metal, what I would end up doing is I would burnish, particularly the wood, so much that any finish I attempt to put on will not have enough open pores or fibers for it to cling to. So in this situation, I would not go up beyond 400. Now I'm up to my second one, which is, if you recall, I said 220. Same situation, back and forth, round and round. Now when I had turned it off, it's slowing down, I stick my fingers up here and sort of rub across it. That burnishes it, cleans off a lot of the dust, so that when it stops, I can get a pretty good look at what's there. Because I did such a good job on the lower grits, I don't have to do as much here. Still got a little bit of a line right here. It's still, because I compressed it, it's not as soft as it was. It is still fairly soft. I mean, if I want to, I could set, you know, I got to push with it. It's not like cedar. Cedar's real soft. I mean, it's harder than cedar, but it's not hard like a hardwood. So yeah, one thing I did not mention is when you're at the leather store or anywhere, it doesn't have to even go to a leather store. You can take an old pair of gloves. Now those tend to be a softer leather, usually thinner. I haven't had a lot of positive results with that turning it. If I laminate it between something, you know, that helps strengthen it, but it's just too soft and too easy to rip and tear. Was that the question earlier? Was the texture of the, yeah. It is soft. The glue, if you soak it long enough, even the Gorilla Glue is not going to penetrate it all the way through. Primarily because one side of that leather, the smooth side, has been sort of burnished, so it's harder. So the pores aren't open, so the glue's not going to soak in as much. It's going to be more of a surface thing, whereas the backside kind of soaks in pretty good. But you're not there to saturate it. You just want good adhesion. Okay. Now I'm up to 320. I mean, everything so far is looking good. I'm not going to need to sand a whole lot with it. Just, you know, kind of give it a nice quick pass. I mean, I see people sand and sand and sand. That's fine. What I tell people is sand till you don't have any scratches. Sand as long as you want. On acrylics and stuff like that, I say you sand, you do your job at each grit, because especially once you start getting up in the higher grits, if you miss it, you got to start all over. So you might as well just do it right the first time. All right, there's that. On up to 400. See here, I'm sanding. I'm still sanding off just a little bit. It's like a soft wood. Now I think I'm going to go ahead and do this one. I have a piece of Abranet here. It's 600. Just to show you why I like it. This is an open weave. So by holding it this way, the dust doesn't build up on top here. It tends to fall through. So and you also notice now with this higher grit, I've got a little bit more of a luster, almost a polished. There you go. All right. You can, whatever finish you put on whatever pen, you got to think about what it is, what your material is. Wood, just about anything you can put, boiled linseed oil, and let it dry. Then you got to think of what the application is, something that's going to be handled a lot, so that's not good. The preferred finish most days is, nowadays, is a CA finish because it's a very durable finish. I'm not the best at it. I have done it, have limited, some success, some failures. Spray lacquer is always a good bet. You need to. I've seen people do it on the lathe. I think it's kind of messy. You got to cover everything up. And I've seen people that their lathe is just coated. So what I would do is take it off. I take a coat hanger, bend it in a long T so it sits there. Then I can hold it and spray it all the way around. Light coats, multiple coats. If you overspray, it tends to drip. That's fixable because then you just go down to the end after it's dried. I have a diamond stone and just set it on there vertically and sands it right off great. Normally I would put because this is a more porous material than typical hardwoods, I would tend to not do a friction finish or something like that. I would stick to either CA or lacquer. Okay, I'm not going to do that for this pen. I'm going to put this in the, raffle, donate. Some lucky person will get it, and I'll include the kit parts, and they can apply whatever finish they feel is appropriate. So, any questions?
Yeah, what kind of glue was he using when you glued the brass tube into the blank?
What glue did you use to put the brass tube into the blank?
I used CA for this tonight just for expediency, time. Thick CA.
Thank you.
You're muted.
I wonder if you ever used a leather dye on that, how would that affect your brass ring?
Leather dye?
Yes.
You ever use leather dye on that, and if so, did it affect your
This
brass?
is natural here. You could use a dye. Normally, you would not dye the entire piece before you glue it. You can get dye together already, that's more expensive, but typically on leather, when you're working it, you would dye the edges. So you would finish the pen, and I would probably dye it, or before I sanded it, and then probably afterwards put another coat on. I cannot answer for the dye and whether it's going to penetrate any other material you fabricated, like wood. If it's all leather, then the leather dye, you'll be okay. Good question. You don't need special tools for it. You can use your pocket knife. You can use, any sort of blade to do it. Like I said, I demonstrated the X-Acto knife. I did sharpen it this morning with a stone. So there you go. Here. Which camera? This one? Oh, and we're at it now. We can look again at the blank we started. You can see how it's foamed up. It's still, because it did not skew. It didn't go wiggly. I mean, it stayed in this little jig and it'll hold up. When I'm done, the wax paper will most likely stay glued to it, but you're going to turn that off anyway. You can just take a knife, cut off the excess foam, the expanded glue. That's another reason to wait, because otherwise you're going to get glue all over your blade, and you don't want that. So Anyway,
What is,
there's that.
Travis,
Wood,
Travis, what is the
I was
drying
thinking
time
about
on
throwing
that
that
glue?
in, but I can't take the clamp off yet, so maybe next month.
He can't hear you, so just wait a second.
Okay.
Okay, what was your question?
What's the drying time on that glue there?
What's the drying time on that Gorilla Glue?
I don't know the specific drying time. As I stated earlier, I always wait overnight.
Okay.
That's overnight suffices for almost any glue.
That sounds good.
And you do not have to use this glue. You can use epoxy. You can use CA. CA, where's your knuckle glue? Knockout glue. Sorry.
It's down there on the end.
I would not use CA, and I made the mistake myself, using CA with metal, because when you're drilling it, if your drill bit's dull, it's going to heat up, and your glue's going to debond. So that's that. You can buy leather in different thicknesses. You heard the expression shoe leather, sole leather is usually much thicker. You can see how, if this camera catches it, this is just a piece compared to its thickness. This piece is thicker. So you can get it in different thicknesses. I've seen it in colors, all different colors. Standard color, I hate to say standard colors, normal colors or common colors like green, red, blue, yellow, black, brown, different shades of brown, burgundy. But anyway, oh, sorry. There you go. Any other questions?
Well, if nobody else has any questions for
We
Travis.
finished a little early.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. That's it. We finished a little early, but I do want to thank you for inviting me. I always have a pleasure. I hope to soon that we'll be back facing in person, because miss a certain amount of that face-to-face interaction. But if you have any questions, feel free to call me or email me, whatever. I also cut some of that. I didn't even use them. Huh. I was going to put these in the blank. I was going to put these pieces of bloodwood in the blank I fabricated and totally spaced it out. But there they are.
Well,
Okay.
Travis,
Thank you very much.
We appreciate the
Travis.
demonstration, and we'll pencil you in a couple times next year.